I want to start by repeating some of the thanks that other speakers have given. I think this has been a really fascinating sort of morning and early afternoon. I realise now this is the sort of sleepy spot, so hopefully there'll be enough sort of the fan, fresh air to keep us going until dinner. So I wanted to talk to you today about work and about the experience of women in work. And what I want to talk about particularly is the experience of women who are in low-paid work, who are unemployed, or who cycle between low-paid work and unemployment. I'm very careful not to use the term low-skilled work, which is one that economists and commentators often like to use. And I think it's a particularly pejorative term that often applies to work that requires a low or no educational qualifications in order to enter that work, but possesses within lots of those jobs very different and varied skills. So the term I prefer to use is low-paid work. I have been working, as was said in the introduction, for 20 years now, starting in welfare to work, delivering programmes to people who were unemployed, who were on long-term unemployment benefits, single mothers, or people who are on sickness benefits, and then moved from that due to sort of a frustration with how poor policy made delivering really good services difficult, into research with the hope that that could then influence better policy, and then became really frustrated with how divorced research was from the reality of delivery on the ground. And so now I try to combine both of those, generally through working for organisations who are delivering on the ground, helping them shape the way that they deliver services and the way that they present their experience on the ground to policymakers. These are some of the organisations that I've worked with in the last couple of years, where I've been focusing really quite heavily on women in low-paid work. And a lot of the findings and the thoughts and ideas that I want to share with you today have come about through the work that I've done for these organisations. So it's been different work for different organisations with slightly different tacks, but there's been a really common theme through all of it. And in part, what that theme has been is absence. And that's really what I'd like to talk about today. So why work? Well, when I started working in the area of employment and unemployment services, one of the things that was really key was the idea that work provided a solution for people. It provided the opportunity for people to move themselves from where they were to something better. It was often described as a route out of poverty, the way that people could move forward. And over time, work also took on sort of this other mythic quality of being able to make people feel better about themselves. And a lot of that came from very good, robust research showing how bad unemployment is for people's health, both their physical and mental health, and the converse, therefore, that working helps people's mental health, it helps people's physical health, there's lots of social benefits to work. And so a lot of the investment that's been put into policies and programmes that help people find work and help people move into work has been predicated on these two pillars: that work is the best way to move out of poverty, and that work will make people feel better and have healthier lives. Now, there's a gap between what the policy suggests and actually what the programmes have been set up to do. What programmes were set up to do was move people into work, and based on that metric, they've been successful. The employment rate in the UK is high. For women, it's just over 70%, which is the highest it's been since records began in 1971. But there are really serious questions about what that work is, what that work means to people, and what the implications are of that work. So there was a release yesterday of data of poverty numbers in London, which showed, sort of built on lots of other evidence that's come up over particularly the last decade, showing the rise in in-work poverty. So we now have a situation in the UK where if you are living in poverty, it is more likely that there is at least one adult in the household who is working than you're living in a workless household. That's a really significant shift from when I started working in this industry 20 years ago, where poverty really was concentrated in workless households. if you're a child living in poverty, you are more likely to have at least one parent who is working than to live with nobody working in the household. Again, a really significant shift, and it really shows that while policies to move people into work have been effective, they've not been enough. We know how to get people into work. We haven't even started to think about what that means in terms of helping people move out of poverty. This is the research that was picked up yesterday in London, which reiterates that point. And really what we've also seen is a very similar story in terms of health. And the original research that a lot of the policies around moving people into work to benefit their health did identify that work needed to be of sufficient quality. But that was sort of, I think, lost in the excitement of the idea of work as part of a healing process for people. And this is Australian research. There's been more recent British research, which has also looked at the impact of zero-hour contracts, which shows that zero-hour contracts are bad for people's mental health. They also have implications, wider health and social implications. So bringing this together, we know that work in and of itself isn't enough. What counts is decent work, quality work, better work. There are lots of different ways that academics and policymakers use to describe the type of work that we want. And it's also very hard to quantify exactly what that is, but from a quite big piece of research that Oxfam did in Scotland, speaking to low-paid workers and people who were unemployed and asking them what they thought decent work was, there are some very key themes around decent pay, around stable, secure work, around predictable hours, around a good relationship with your team manager, opportunities to progress. A lot of things that people who have advantages in the labour market take for granted. Now, one of the reasons that it's difficult to understand how much work has helped people move out of poverty is because we don't measure it. The interest has always been in, even though the policy rhetoric has been about work helping people move out of poverty and live healthier lives, the activity and the policy has actually been moving people into work. And so I think one of the really key things that we need to do is start to think about how do we measure this and what implications will that have for the services that we offer. It's all very well talking about decent work, but if our main mechanism for moving people into work, Job Centre Plus, is only measured and incentivised on job entry and on job sustainability, then really we're not going to be able to start making any inroads into poverty through the use of work. Now, while sort of all that was happening, at the same time, the world of work has been changing. So I'm sure that you are increasingly aware, because I know this is impacting a lot on academic contracts as well, but there has been a big increase in zero-hour contracts, an increase in temporary work, an increase in use of agencies and contracting out. And all of these measures impact more on women than on men. So women are more likely to be in part-time work, unstable work, low-paid work, temporary work, agency workers, and on zero-hour contracts. It's probably worth at this point just differentiating between insecure work and unpredictable work, because they're often conflated, but they are quite different. So insecure work is work that is on a short-term contract or with an agency when you don't know how long you'll be working for. You might be moving between employers, you don't know how long a job is, you may have periods of unemployment in between pieces of work. Unpredictable work can be secure. So you could have a contract that is a permanent contract, but your hours are unpredictable. So it could be minimum hours or 0 hours, meaning that you can't plan financially. You don't know how much money you'll be bringing home. And while some of the issues are the same, as an individual, in that it's difficult to plan, it's difficult to plan other things around in your life because you don't know when you'll be working, the mechanisms that are needed to address them are different. So it's important that we understand they're two different things. This chart shows the increase in these types of work. See, full-time employment at the bottom has been increasing in the UK and is a really big driver of the increasing numbers of women moving into work. But at the same time, all of these other types of insecure or unpredictable work have also been increasing. And particularly for women, self-employment and low-paid self-employment has been a real driver of the growth of women moving into work. And this shows us how self-employment has gone up. Now, when people talk about work, and having been in this field for 20 years, I've been very excited by how much work has been on the agenda in the last few years. It really is around this idea of the future of work, and the bit that really gets people going is robots and automation and artificial intelligence, and how these things are going to change the world that we work in. Are we going to have more leisure time? Do we need basic income? And lots of these areas that seem, I think, very exciting, probably very exciting for the media to go and cover big glass offices with people swanning around and playing pool. But I'd like to talk about a different part of the future of work, which is around the logistics of work. And I think where the opportunities lie in terms of improvements in technology, but also where some of the concerns for me are in terms of the absence of the way that we talk about the future of work for women. So in terms of work moving, in terms of looking at how work will develop in the future, there are some really good examples of how technology has been used by women to improve the quality of their jobs by working together to build a better working structure. And a really good example of this comes from London with a group of carers. Now, social care is quite a toxic subject in the UK. When Labour tried to introduce new measures around social care, the media jumped on it as a death tax, and I think the Conservatives at the time, social care changes really probably sank the Conservatives' sort of election earlier this year. It's a really toxic subject, but it's a huge growth area with the demographic shift that we have, and obviously with Brexit as well. And care workers are very low paid. They're predominantly women. 82% of care workers are women. It is an industry in which there's no opportunity for progression. It's incredibly flat. There are care workers, there are very few managers, and they earn very little income. They don't earn much more. So there aren't progression routes. You can't build escalators really unless you change into a different organisation. The amount of money that care workers earn is kept low because they're commissioned by local authorities that have had their budgets cut, and there's pressure to kind of keep those costs low. So the pressure comes from a number of areas. And care workers also tend to work over a longer period of time in the day than they're paid for. So there are real peaks in terms of demand. So there are need for care workers around breakfast time, around lunchtime, and around dinner time. But they won't necessarily be needed in between those bits. So while they may be working at both ends of the day, they won't be being paid in the middle. And particularly in London, they could be working a long way from home, and so not able to go home and utilise that time. So the project that Timewise and Rathbone did was to say to a group of care workers, if you were to work together and if you were to look at your job, how could you design it so that it worked better for you, and so that even though your pay per hour didn't increase, the amount of money you got for the hours you worked increased because you didn't have these big sort of dead gaps in the middle. And they worked with a group of women who developed compatible scheduling, where they basically worked as a team. They used technology and apps and scheduling apps to design a way that as a group they could work as a team. And what it did was it just gave them power over the hours that they worked. They had control that they didn't have before, and it also meant that they were working less time for the same pay, so that it felt that they were earning more even if they weren't. So I think there are some real opportunities for future of work that lie beyond robots and really are around taking control of the way that we work and the way that we want to work, and starting to ask questions about what we think work is, what we want work to be like, what we want our work and our lives to look like. Some of the work that I've been doing with Oxfam has been looking at this under the title of Work in Life, which has been around looking at giving women, particularly migrant women, and women who are very marginalised and disadvantaged in the labour market more control over their working lives, so that they can integrate different aspects, whether it's working in their community, paid work, voluntary work, involvement in children's school, mixing it all together and working out a solution that really works for them. I think the other big issue around the future of work in the UK is obviously Brexit, and women have been startlingly absent from the discussion of Brexit. I'm sure many of you will have seen on social media the all-male bar one woman team that went to negotiate Brexit at the beginning. There's no mention of women in the Brexit white paper. Any coverage of Brexit tends to have industries that are very male dominated, so they'll go to a car factory and talk about the impact on cars where there are lots of men that work. There are far more women that work in textiles or in the food industry, and those industries are more reliant on the EU than the car industry, but they tend to be forgotten in this discussion. So I think, again, it's a story of the absence of what will happen to women as we move forward. And a lot of the rights that women have at work obviously are underpinned by EU legislation, and we don't know what will happen to those either. I've gone the wrong way, sorry. The second area that I want to talk about that builds into this and actually picks up on some of the presentations that we had in the last session are about the way that we talk about careers and the way that we talk to girls, young women and older women about what they want their jobs to look like and the way that they want to work. Now I find the way that there's been quite a lot of emphasis on progression in my field, but it's been very traditional. It's an idea that you go and work with an employer and you access training through that employer, and then you move up the rungs, and that in that way you can progress and earn more. But as I've already said, a lot of industries that are dominated by women, a lot of low-paying industries that are dominated by women don't have those progression routes. They're very flat structures. And this traditional approach also relies on employers investing in their workforce. And we know that in the UK, employers are far more likely to invest in their workforce that are already highly skilled or highly qualified. They're much more likely, if you're a graduate, you're much more likely to get trained by your employer than if you come in straight as a school leaver. And so the way that we've been thinking about progression and increasing levels of conditionality around progression don't really meet the needs of the people who probably need the most support in order to move and to progress. So I don't think that people's careers look like this. I think this is what it looks like. I think you sort of start at one side of a very busy river and you have to work out how to get to the other side. And I don't think it's clear. There isn't a path, there's maybe some rocks. But it's terrifying because if you fall, you know what's going to happen. And I think there are advantages you have that make it easier. I think if you have a supportive family, if you have a good education, if you have great networks, if you have lots of information and understand the structures, that makes the jumps easier. If you have support structures, that makes the fall less scary. And one of the things I want to talk about a little bit later is the importance of creating a safety net and making sure you have a strong safety net so that people can take risks. But if this is what working life looks like, and if this is what we're expecting people to learn to navigate, then why are we creating progression services that help you climb a ladder? What we really need is to help people to understand how you navigate this, how you work this out, how you can be fit enough and strong enough to jump from piece to piece, metaphorically fit rather than actually fit. But the services that we have in place are not fit for purpose, they're not fit for the current labour market. And also the way that we talk about work from when children are very young doesn't help. It doesn't help girls and young women to really think about the skills that they'll need and the way that they can use school, education, family, networks to help them progress. I was really taken by this quote about the way that boys and girls are talked to differently about jobs and the role that they play in their lives. And I thought about it again when I read some research into an active labour market programme in Argentina. And this programme in Argentina was designed to help people move from unemployment into work. The majority of the people who went through the programme were women. The best outcomes in terms of quality of jobs were gained by the men. So the researchers looked at these outcomes and said, it doesn't really make sense. Why are women moving into worse jobs than men when there are more of them? And the researchers came to two conclusions. One was around the structure of the labour market in Argentina. They felt that there were a lot of gender inequalities that meant that opportunities were open to men that weren't open to women. And I think that's true to varying degrees in a number of places. But the second thing that's really important, particularly when you put it against this sort of background, is that women were making choices as they went through the training programme that disadvantaged them in the labour market. They were choosing the bits of training, they were choosing the bits of support that made it easier for them to transition into lower paid, less secure, less predictable work. They weren't choosing the things that helped them progress further. And it happens here too. We have a new apprenticeship scheme in the UK, and girls and young women are far more likely to take apprenticeships in low-paying sectors. So the sectors that offer opportunities for you to have control over your working life, have more financial control, make choices, are heavily, heavily dominated by boys and young men. Even the photos of people doing those apprenticeships are heavily, heavily dominated by boys and young men. And actually, we've seen a reverse in the last 10 years by 1 percentage point, but still is from 5% to 4% of the number of girls who are going into engineering apprenticeships that offer real opportunities for taking far more control over your life and your career. Sorry, thank you. And I think added to that, we see that across the board, women are more likely to take apprenticeships in low-paying sectors. They're more likely to go into low-paying jobs, and then that continues and carries through their whole life. And actually, we don't just see this in low-paying jobs. In surveys of graduates, females' expectations of their earnings at the point when they're still at university are lower than their male comparators. They're more likely to move into low-paid work once they graduate from university, and then that's compounded over time, particularly when the motherhood penalty kicks in. So the gender pay gap is partly driven by the structure of the labour market, but it's also driven by this idea of what people's expectations are, and the fact that we don't really talk about the control that work potentially offers you over your own life, and the importance of that level of independence. So the third area that I want to talk about is those safety nets. This is a piece of research that looks at 23 countries and is looking at job mobility. Now, one of the things we do know about progression is that one of the best ways to improve your conditions at work, your pay at work, is to move jobs. So really, people who move jobs and are able to move from one job to another have the best rates of progression. It's not that surprising. But what we see is that you're far more likely to do that if there is a strong safety net. Now, I spoke earlier about the fact that people have personal safety nets, and obviously if you have friends, family, a support network, that enables you to do it. But the state safety net is really, really important for enabling people to feel that they can move from one job to another. And what we've seen in the UK has been a real diminution of that safety net. And what we've seen has been a shift of risk from a number of different factors to the individual. So I've talked about the way employers have shifted risk by moving to 0-hour contracts, to unpredictable work, to temporary contracts, and now all of the risk lies with the worker, not with the employer, and there's no financial recompense. But this shift has also been sort of mirrored in the support system. So while you might expect to see risk increasing in one area and so it being sort of supported in another, what we've actually seen is people being exposed to risk across the board. I don't have time to go into this in a huge amount of detail now, but the move in the UK to universal credit is going to put far more risk for individuals claiming benefits, both in terms of the delay it takes to get paid, but also in the fact that financial incentives don't sit there for the types of jobs that women are more likely to go into when they first move out of unemployment. So mini jobs, which is not working very many hours a week, low paid self-employment, or being the second earner in a family. And all of those things are really, really important in terms of your first step across that river. and all of them are being supported less through the new benefits system. In terms of adult skills through further education, there's been a shift away from that being paid for, which there were lots of problems with before in the way that it was paid for, to a loan system, which again increases risk on the individual and has seen a sort of really steep drop-off in terms of people taking up loans and taking up learning, and this has happened at the same time as there's been a huge cut to the further education budget, and particularly to the ESOL budget, which is for people who need help with speaking English, meaning that people who are migrants to this country with poor English are even more disadvantaged in the labour market and have even less opportunity to move out. And also in the childcare structures, where government funding for childcare isn't sufficient to really fund enough places, and childcare is still set up along a working structure that doesn't really exist anymore for many people who need that type of support. And this has happened, this has happened at the same time as people's power has been taken away. So a lot of the interactions with the state have seen a more draconian approach. There has been more conditions placed on people's benefits, so people have less power over their lives. And at the same time at work, if you are in a low paid job, your feelings of autonomy are likely to have dropped. Conversely, if you are in a high paid job in the last 10 years, you will have felt that you have more autonomy at work, you're more able to make decisions, you're more able to work flexibly. But for the people who are at the other end of the pay scale, that's dropped off. So we have a safety net that's leaky and saggy. It's also absent in a lot of the discussions about the changes that are happening at the moment. These are two big reports that came out in the UK in the last couple of months, and neither of them talk about the safety net. And guess who the safety net works for the most? For women. And it's sort of, Matthew Taylor's report has some really good stats on women and no recommendations whatsoever that directly apply to women. The IPPR report talks about how work and the economy can improve, and it doesn't touch on the role that the safety net or skills or benefits or social security tie into that. And in fact, on their panel of commissioners, there is nobody with expertise in that area. So I think the question is, in terms of the future of work and how we make work better for women, how do we build guardrails? How do we make that support? How do we make the safety net work better? And I think there are 4 key areas that I don't have time to go into in any depth now, but we can maybe pick up in the questions. The first one is around a safety net that meets people's demand. We need a social security system that works for people, that supports people to move into work and then find better work. There's a huge opportunity to use networks, to use mentors, and to use navigators. And we know from the best practice examples that we have that these really work well, particularly for women. Women work well in groups, they work well supporting each other. There's a huge investment in networking and mentoring programs for women who are in middle and high management and in tech and in lots of areas. There's not really that investment for carers or people who work in retail or for cleaners, but there's no reason why that sort of approach or that sort of training wouldn't work in the same way. The future of work needs to be about job redesign and how we can make jobs better and work better. And when we talk about skills and learning, we need to move beyond apprenticeships, and we need to move beyond higher education and how universities are funded, and think about how people who are working in low-paid work, who are in insecure work, access skills and how they can use them to help them move forward. I'd be really interested in talking to any of you in more detail after this about experiences you have in the countries that you've come from and the way that they interact with this. And these are my details here. Thank you very much.